Well, we're wrapping up our series on failing faith this week with episode 4. And over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the different things that can cause a Christian, a follower of Jesus, to have a challenge with their faith, to see what would happen if their faith crumbled. In fact, one of the things that we've been saying over these last few weeks is that these are not just questions that Christians ask, but it's also questions that non-Christians ask. They might even be reasons why a person who is interested in Christianity doesn't want to jump right in because of these questions. So in the first week, Jeff was here and he reminded us that God's goodness to us is not dependent on our goodness to God. That God doesn't require us to earn His approval, but that He loves and accepts us just as we are. And in episode 2, what we talked about is that just because we can't see God there doesn't mean that He's not there. And that oftentimes God works in the background, and we can't see immediately what God is doing, but with the gift of time, we can look back and see clearly where God has been moving. And then last week in episode 3, we talked about how doubt is not a bad thing. That doubt can actually be something that grows your faith. It can be the catalyst for strengthening your faith. And so this week, as we wrap up our series, I wanted to talk about something that is something that I think we all have experienced at some point in our life, or we will experience at some point in our life. And that is the experience of enduring through grief, whether that is loss of a loved one, or loss of a job, a career, a business. Over this last year and change, as we've gone through this worldwide pandemic, we've seen that exacerbated, not only in our neighborhoods and in our communities, but also around the country and around the world. And it can be a moment when it causes us to question our faith because we want to understand how a loving God could allow us to experience these things that we grieve for. Why would a God who loves me allow me to grieve? And it's in that question that we can come to a place where our faith fails us. In fact, there have been people, and you may know of people, who walked away from their faith in moments of grief. And so today what I want to do is I want us together to look at a story, an account of an event that happened in the Scriptures, an event that happened that was centered around Jesus and a person that Jesus loved very much, and how we can't see everything that God can see. And sometimes it's important for us to understand that we don't know what God's plans are or how we fit into it. And so we're going to be looking at the Scriptures today, and it's the story of a man named Lazarus. Now, if you grew up in church, if you are a person who reads the Bible, then the account of Lazarus' death is probably very, very familiar to you. John writes it this way. He says, "A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha." And so to give us some background, he tells us or reminds us of who Mary was. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. And it says, so the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." Because there was something in Martha and Mary that they knew that if they could just get to Jesus, that everything would be okay. And so they sent word right away. They sent messengers to go out to find Jesus and to tell Jesus, the one that you love, this person, your very dear friend, is very, very sick. And then listen to what Jesus says. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, It happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Now see, he's trying to tell them, he's here talking to his disciples, and he's trying to tell them that there is something going on here that is bigger than simply Lazarus being sick. That there is something going on here that is happening for the glory of God and is going to bring about glory to God, glory to Jesus. There's something more than what you see. And so when the messenger comes and tells Jesus that Lazarus, his very dear friend, the one that he loves, is sick, Jesus doesn't pick up his stuff right away and run towards them. Instead, Jesus waits. He waits for 2 days. And it just seems odd. I mean, if he's going to do something, if he's going to save Lazarus, shouldn't he go right now? Shouldn't he go right away? But he didn't. He waited. And I don't know if you were at that time, if you were one of the disciples who was listening to Jesus, I don't know what they may have been thinking. Like, Jesus, come on, he's sick, he's dying. We should go do something about it. I mean, I've seen you do miracles. I've seen you save people who were not this sick. So let's go and let's heal him. He's your friend. And Jesus decides to wait for 2 days. And then he says, 2 days later, he says to his disciples, he says, okay, let's go back. We're going to head back. We're going to go to Judea, and we're going to head through on to Bethany where Lazarus is. The story picks up and it says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. For 4 days. So we are sure now that Lazarus is dead. He's been in the grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. And so it was a sad time for Martha and Mary because they had lost their brother. And Lazarus was a well-respected, well-known man in his community, and so there were many, many people who were mourning his death. The next verse says, when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Now, today I want us to look at the responses of Mary and the response of Martha, because in these two responses we see two different responses to an event that may challenge our faith. Because each of these ladies who loved Jesus, loved their brother, they were both grieving over this horrible thing that they had experienced. They approached their faith in two different ways. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. She was expressing her faith in Jesus that he had the power to save him if he was there. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. See, she was saying, listen, if you were here, he wouldn't have died, but now he's dead. But I know that even now, if you can still do something about it. It's not too late. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And Martha understood this as being that future time, in the future time in the future, where Jesus is going to come again. She says, yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. See, that's what she was thinking about. She was thinking about far, far off in the future. And Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. And then he says, do you believe this, Martha? Do you believe it? Do you believe that I am the resurrection and the life? Yes, Lord, she told him, I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. And so here is Martha's response to this challenge to her faith, to this time of grief and loss. Her response was, I know you could have done something. You didn't do something. I know it's not too late. You can still make a difference. Now listen to Mary's response. Then she returned to Mary. This is Martha. She went back to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you, talking about Jesus. So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, so they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. And that was all she said. See, Mary's response was a response of no hope. Mary's response was a response of, it's too late, nothing is going to change this, it's been done. Mary's response was, God, you had an opportunity to make a difference and you didn't do it. And that was the end of her response. There was no hope in it. You see, despite Mary and Martha asking Jesus to come and to heal their brother, Jesus chose to allow Lazarus to die. Because Jesus had a plan that Mary and Martha and no one who was there at the time understood. He had a plan that would bring God glory, and Mary and Martha didn't understand it. Because sometimes there is suffering. And even though God can immediately fix the situation in the snap of a finger, sometimes he doesn't, because God sees past where we see. God sees the big picture. And God will do things that might cause suffering in the short term, because in the long term, it's going to bring him glory. And that glory is not just for the sake of giving God glory, but it's glory that also strengthens our faith and our trust in him. We skip down to a little bit farther, and it says Jesus was heading towards the tomb. He actually went to Lazarus' tomb, and when he got there, there was a bunch of people there who were mourning, and they were crying, and they were weeping. And it says, Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb. A cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Now, there was a tradition back then that what the Jewish people believed was that the spirit would continue to remain hovering over the body for the first 3 days. And so I'm sure that Jesus wanted to change, to make sure that no one was going to say that it was just the spirit that popped back into Lazarus. And so it was on the 4th day that all of this transpired. It was on the 4th day when he's like as dead can be. And Martha's even worried because he's been in there for 4 days, and she's worried about the smell. Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? And so they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. You see, Jesus wants not just for this to bring glory to himself, that everybody's going to say, wow, Jesus, you're amazing. But what Jesus wants is he wants all of the people who were standing around, all of the people who would later hear about this, he wants you and me to believe that he is the Son of God by doing this, that this is going to increase our faith and trust in him. That was the entire purpose of this event. It says, then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave cloths, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." And Lazarus was alive. Now, did Jesus raise Lazarus to life so that Lazarus would never die? No. Is Lazarus alive today? No. Lazarus lived the rest of his life, and he died just like many of the people who died at that time. Lazarus isn't alive today. So the purpose of Jesus raising Lazarus to life wasn't to say that you never have to die. The purpose of Jesus raising Lazarus to life was to show everybody, to be a witness, to be a testimony to everybody, that the power of death, the power of permanent death, cannot overcome the power of Jesus. You see, just as we see in Jesus' response to Mary and Martha's grief, as bad as our suffering can be, whether it is the loss of a loved one or the loss of a marriage, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a child, whether it be an unpaid mortgage, a foreclosure notice, an eviction notice, whether it's the loss of a business, whatever loss it is, that these things for a Christian are not random. They're not. We know the reason why we suffer, but we know that there is a reason for it, because our suffering in some way will bring God's glory, will bring God's glory back to us, that will actually increase our faith in God and not break our faith apart. Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples who knew Jesus so well, he would write in one of his manuscripts, he would write that God sees 1,000 years as one day. Meaning, to the creator of the universe, the creator of time, our Heavenly Father, to him, time operates at a different level. See, God may allow someone we care about to die 2, 3, or even 7 decades early, but in the imposing scope of eternity, in the entire time that we have, it's just a drop in the sand. It's a drop in the sand. It's a grain of sand on the beach compared to eternity. And it's only as if though they'd been gone for a few minutes. You know, the interesting thing about that verse is it also says that to God a day is like 1,000 years, which means not only does God see the big picture, but in those moments where we grieve, that God takes that enduring, slow grief with us, because we don't see everything that God sees. For those of you who are Marvel Universe fans, and for those of you who are not, you're going to have to figure this out. And if you haven't watched the movie Endgame, then you should go watch it, because it was pretty good. But in the movie Endgame, the bad guy was a guy named Thanos. That's him over there. And he's trying to get the Infinity Stones to put in that thing he has. All of you are going to tell me what it is. I know. I can't remember what they call it. But when he gets all of the Infinity Stones there, then he's going to snap his fingers and he's going to just make half of the entire population disappear. It's just gone, right? And so the Avengers are trying to stop this. And Doctor Strange, who is one of the Avengers, has one of those Infinity Stones. He has the Time Stone. And so they all know that Thanos can't snap his fingers and instantly eliminate half of everybody who is alive. He can't do that unless he gets all of the stones. So they're trying to keep that last stone away from him. And Dr. Strange hands over the Infinity Stone, the Time Stone, to Thanos. And there's this interesting conversation that Dr. Strange has with Iron Man. And he says that he's looked at like 14 million different combinations of how this can all play out. And the only one that makes sense is for him to give the Time Stone to Thanos, which is incomprehensible for everybody else, because it's like you're giving the person the means of defeating you. You're giving them what is going to cause your destruction. But you see, Dr. Strange had already seen all of the other possible scenarios would end up the same way. And the only one that had a chance was for him to give the Time Stone to Thanos. And in the end, it turned out that it was right, because he was able to see the big picture. And in our lives, in the lives that we lead, in the comings and goings, in all of the different things that come into play together to form what you and I call our life, Jesus sees past just what we can see, and Jesus sees the big picture. Jesus knew that raising Lazarus from the dead would not only be a testimony to Lazarus, to Mary, to Martha, to all of the people who were mourning and grieving for Lazarus' death. Not only to them, and not only to all of the people who would hear about it, all of the people who would be talking about it, all of the people who would be writing about it. It wasn't just a testimony to them, but it would actually be the act that set into place the series of events that would cause the religious leaders of that time to just go crazy and decide that Jesus wasn't just somebody that they had to deal with, but it was that Jesus had to be was somebody that they had to have killed. It set off a series of events that would end in his crucifixion. And in his crucifixion would result in his resurrection and his proving that he was greater than death, and him paying the price for you and for me, to never have to think about an eternal death. Jesus saw the big picture. But at the same time, it's hard to think in our own suffering. I don't know anybody who says it's okay for me to suffer because I see the big picture. Suffering is painful. But the beautiful thing about God is that when we suffer, he experiences that suffering with us. See, back earlier in the story, it says when Jesus saw her weeping, this is Mary, and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. See, this deep anger that welled up within him was an anger that Lazarus had died. Even though he allowed it to happen, he saw these people who were weeping and wailing, and he felt compassion for all of those people who were mourning over Lazarus. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see," and led Jesus to the tomb. And then it says, then Jesus wept. And there's so much that has been written on that word wept because it's so simple. Jesus wept. And yet, when we look at the translation of it, and when we imagine what Jesus was doing, Jesus was crying uncontrollably. In fact, that verse that says that he had a deep anger and was deeply moved, that phrase deeply moved literally means to snort like a horse. Jesus wasn't just crying, he was he was uncontrollably crying. He was weeping and he was mourning with them. Like people who saw Jesus, they understood it. It says the people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." But some said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" See, I understand for them, this scene can be very, very confusing because it seems like Jesus intentionally let Lazarus die. But you see, Jesus had a plan. His plan was to help others experience the joy of knowing him by revealing his own incredible power. But see, Jesus also knew that Lazarus would be raised from the dead in 4 days. So why did Jesus cry? Why was Jesus angry? And why did the King of the universe weep like an uncontrollable animal? It's because Jesus wept because of the suffering experienced by his friends, by those people who were around, by people that he loved. He wept because he saw the sadness of those people who were around him. And that sadness was really a microcosm of the sadness that we all feel at some point or another in our lives. Jesus became a mourner. He was a mourner just like everyone else because the people that he loved were heartbroken. And when we are heartbroken, Jesus is heartbroken too. And yes, it was a short amount of time. And absolutely, when we think about heaven and life eternal, even the most difficult life that a follower of Jesus has to live will one day be a short, faded memory. But despite all of this, our Heavenly Father, who knows infinitely more than you and I could ever imagine, he weeps for us and he weeps with us through our pain. The great Protestant reformer Martin Luther lost a son, and his wife Katie shouted at him and said, "Where was God when our son died?" And Luther replied, "The same place he was when his son died. He was there watching and weeping." You see, our sorrow is God's sorrow also. When we feel sorrow, he feels sorrow. And we can trust in that it is not without a purpose, it is not without a plan, and that is the catalyst for growing our faith, not for allowing it to fail. You see, in those moments when we come to this point where our faith may be failing us, see, rather than letting it be a setback, we can look back at it and we can see that it is the beginning of a stronger relationship with Jesus, a stronger trust in Jesus, because it will become a faith on the other side of suffering, on the other side of grief. That faith is a faith that is not naive or simplistic, but it's a faith that is not dry or cynical either. Because sometimes tears have to fall for life to begin again. And though we cry now, we're promised that one day all of our tears will be wiped away. They will be wiped away because everything will have been restored. Everything will have been returned. And that's the promise that Jesus has for you and me. That's the promise. And that is why in those moments when it may be that we think that our faith is failing, that if we keep our eyes focused on Jesus, if we keep our thoughts focused on him, that they don't become points in our lives where our faith fails, but they can become points in our life where our faith grows. And so my prayer for you is that as you walk through your life, that in those moments of grief and sorrow, that you remember that God accepts you just as you are. So you don't have to worry about being good enough for Him to accept you. I pray that you will remember that God is there with you, that even though you can't see Him, that He's working behind the scenes for the good of those who love Him. I pray that you will remember to lean on those around you, that God has put people in your life to bring you the support and the encouragement and to be a source of hope for you. And I pray that those moments when your faith begins to fail, that it would actually be a moment where your faith grows, where your faith strengthens, and you'll see that your faith endures.